Hello. While Scotch has the stereotype of aristocrats in libraries with cigars, American whiskey carries the stereotype of the American frontier with poker tables, guns, and shots of firewater. The reality is that American whiskey is catching up to Scotch on the world stage, with large multinational conglomerates producing more and more, accompanied by an explosion of small craft producers serving the ever-thirsty domestic market. Let's explore American whiskey. American whiskey was much easier to define a decade ago, as the big producers had consolidated so much production after Prohibition, and an American style was pretty much set. Distilleries are now opening and some closing all across the country, now with exciting new styles and innovation happening everywhere. Single malts, Irish single pot still whiskey, quinoa to whiskey from an experimental new perennial grain Kernza are all part of the vibrant American craft whiskey scene. Now, this lecture assumes you're familiar with distillation technology, fermentation science, and basic enzymatic hydrolysis. If not, please go ahead and refresh your knowledge with those lectures before continuing here. We are going to look deeper into a couple American whiskey categories, including the most popular bourbon, our Tennessee whiskey, and rye whiskey, which are also the ones covered in the WSET Level 3 award in spirits. We'll go into mash bills, yeast choices, still types, maturation protocols, and look over the legal labeling requirements. First, let's get the legal stuff out of the way. Alcohol regulation is a tangled mess in the US, with the Department of Treasury's Alcohol and Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau, the TTB, regulating aspects of alcohol production, some importation and wholesale distribution, labeling, and advertising. States themselves then handle their own importation and consumption rules. Whiskey at the TTB has over 35 categories, including light whiskey and blended whiskey, but no Tennessee whiskey, no moonshine either. Anyway, whiskey under international regulations means a spirit made from a fermented mash of grains. But blended whiskey in the US is a mix of a straight whiskey at least 20%, but then the ability to add neutral spirits of no grain origin. This means it's not actually a whiskey outside of the US and should certainly not be confused with Scotch blended whiskey. Now, we won't be discussing this category except that it exists. Similarly with light whiskey, which has odd restrictions almost to make it an outlier by law. For instance, it has a minimum distillation strength of 80 ABV or 160 proof and must be aged in new barrels that can't have been charred or used barrels. Within those 35 categories, you can find all sorts of permutations and argument starters and argument settlers, but again, we're just going to look at the ones I previously mentioned. Haters, just head to the comments. Our overarching whiskey category states it is a grain-based distillate coming off the stills at less than 95% ABV or 190 proof and bottled at least 40% ABV and should look, taste, smell, and walk like what people expect whiskey to walk like. Our bourbon and rye we'll be looking at are legal subtypes in this class and have further restrictions. We'll talk about Tennessee legalities a bit later, but Tennessee is not even mentioned at all in the TTB documentation. But know that all three of these share similar production methods. The grain recipe or mash bill is almost never a single grain, with the exception of the new American single malt category. And these will usually contain corn, rye, wheat, and or barley in either malted or unmalted versions. Exogenous enzymes are allowed and usually are added alongside endogenous ones to ensure a good ferment, especially at larger scale productions. We generally do not mash or distill the grains separately. So as discussed in our hydrolysis lecture, we start with high heat to gelatinize, say, our corn before any rye or wheat gets added, and then our malt or other enzymes before we bring it down to 64°C, which is optimal for enzyme activity. Corn, which we'll see is mandated in bourbon, is a Native American grain and brings an often subtle sweet corn, cornbread, and even butterscotch character. There are a ton of varieties, with more being engineered all the time. Non-engineered varieties or non-GMO corn is increasingly difficult to get a hold of due to the nature of the U.S. agricultural system. Rye was an original North American grain and is experiencing a resurgence these days. Rye is a little tricky to work with as it gets really sticky and gooey, so high percentages create some challenges. However, that bright, peppery, lemon zest rye bread snap or bite is being reappreciated and is back in fashion from choice rather than necessity. Rye can be malted, and there is a rye malt whiskey category mandating malted rye, but rye doesn't bring the enzyme power of barley, although adding malted rye will reduce a little bit of that bite and add some more bready-like character. Wheat is popular as a third grain and brings a soft mouthfeel and bread dough aromas. It's often used just to tone down stronger flavors, from rye especially. And though we can use exogenous enzymes, malted barley has always had a place in American whiskey, and more American single malts are seen in the marketplace. As in Scotland, malt whiskey has characteristic malt and cereal aromas and flavors. Like Scotland, milder enzyme-heavy distiller's malt is the common form of malt, though smaller producers will play with darker malts for their flavors rather than enzyme efficiencies. But outside of American single malts, our barley tends to be a minor flavor component, or at least subtle compared to our other grains. This ability to blend multiple grains is a key determinant in the styles, with some styles having mandated minimums. Our bourbon must have 51% corn. Actual corn whiskey, 80% corn. The other style with the grain mentioned come with a 51% minimum. So rye, wheat, malt, rye malt, etc. are minimums of 51%. Note the difference there on Scotch malt whiskey at 100% versus American malt whiskey and it's 51%. Now the TTB doesn't even have a legal definition of single malt. Whatever makes up the other smaller percentages of the mash bill are called the small grains, and they can make a substantial stylistic contribution. Say Maker's Mark and Weller, though both are bourbons, they let wheat play a large part in creating their softer style. Different than many Scotch producers, American distillers will often play with a few different mash bills and/or different yeast strains to allow for flexibility in creating blends or for different aging protocols. Often a producer will use different yeast for different mash bills in order to create maximum ethanol or for specific ester creation. Like at Four Roses, you can often see a code on the bottle or online where the mash bill, usually the E, which is more corn, or the B, more rye, is then combined with 5 of their proprietary yeast strains, nicknamed V, K, O, Q, and F. The master distiller Brent Elliott, who manages these calls, he calls fermentation a controlled chaos, with really only 5% of a batch variation creating distinct flavors. Now, prior to fermentation, we often use the acidic residue from the column still, which contains lots of less volatile fatty acids to acidify and provide nutrients for the yeast. This backset, as it's called, can be as much as 30% of the mash. It's not mandated, but most large producers do this process, which is called sour mashing. If you aren't sour mashing, you are likely having to acidify your mash in other ways prior to fermentation to make sure the mash is compatible pH-wise with your chosen yeast. Now, sour mashing doesn't often appear on labels despite its ubiquity, but we do see it on most Jack Daniel's bottles along with the term Tennessee whiskey. Now, Tennessee whiskey, again, is never mentioned by the TTB, and its legal definition eventually came about at the state level barely 10 years ago. NAFTA in the early 90s was the first time Tennessee whiskey even had any legal definition, that of a straight bourbon made in Tennessee. It wasn't until 2013 that the Tennessee legislature defined Tennessee whiskey as a straight bourbon that must be filtered through maple charcoal prior to aging. Jack Daniel's dominates this category, and they use a 80% corn mash bill and a specific strain of yeast that creates strong banana-flavored esters, often now considered a trait of the category rather than the producer. That charcoal filtering or Lincoln County process happens after distillation, so we'll go deeper there after we talk stills. As we go into distillation, we don't have mandated still types for whiskey, although a particular style made by Vendôme is very common for most of our producers looking for character rather than neutral spirit. These are modified column stills with 10 to 20 plates that then lead into a little pot-looking still called a doubler or a thumper, similar to the retorts seen in the Caribbean. As you'll see, they may be shaped like pots, but they aren't used like pot stills. This distillation method may seem a bit convoluted, and while there have been attempts to just use modern columns, there is some magic in this apparatus that creates a style that just can't seem to be duplicated otherwise. A challenge certainly exists with these multiple parts getting into equilibrium, as deflegmators generally aren't used either. For smaller distillers, hybrids like those from Coty, and those are becoming more of the norm for their flexibility. But in these older, original, or traditional modified columns, many from Vendôme, they have a pretty unique distillation protocol. Our fermented grain, juice, or wort in the US is called distiller's beer rather than wash, and it tends to have a lot of solids in it compared to our single grain washes, say, in Scotland. We send the cooled down beer through a condenser called a beer heater attached to the head of the first still, or beer still, where it warms up before entering the column. We can't really use direct heat with all the goo in the distiller's beer, so we are usually using steam injection. That keeps us from burning those solids and reduces Maillard reactions, but with all that stuff in there, Maillard reactions do occur. If you remember, we are then collecting the leftover solids, or Backset collecting at the bottom of the beer still. But remember, this is a continuous still, so once we are in dynamic equilibrium, we have a steady, consistent stream leaving the top of the still. Usually no separate heads or tails being removed from this type of still. We will pull off or recycle from that beer heater and the doubler, which is a second distillation tool, early on to let things get up to temperature. But once it's running, we do have some group 3s continuing to come off from both of these. So what is this doubler? Coming out of our column, we either head to a thumper or a doubler. With the doubler, it's a finishing still of sorts that is usually indirectly steam heated. With this setup, we condense with a beer still condenser into a low wines holding tank and then feed that liquid into the doubler. We have another distillation that happens here, and when the temperature at the head of the doubler is right, again, this is only right when starting up, we then start continuously collecting the new make, or what's called white dog, after it goes through a double condenser. If we are feigning sophistication, we won't say white dog, but call the new make our high wines as opposed to low wines. Now, while we are getting things up to temperature at the beginning, we will separate the early stuff coming out of the doubler and hold it for the next batch. And while running, we will end up collecting some group 3s and recycling those back to the beer still. But again, this isn't a batch distillation where we're catching any real heads or tails. This entire operation runs continuously once started. We aren't stopping and restarting at that low wine tank. Depending on our scale, we may run this operation for a week or for only a day if it's a smaller one. We then shut off all the heat, and the residue left over in the still is that backset. And then the doubler's remains go back into the beer still for the next distillation. That high particulate distiller's beer has left goo all over the beer still. If we had rye in the bill, we have an even messier situation that we then clean out. Sometimes we don't use the independently heated doubler and instead use the heat from the column to come right out from the beer still and straight into a small distillation vessel called a thumper. It is heated by those incoming vapors and fills with condensing group 3s. The hot vapor hitting the slightly cooler liquid causes reflux and a rather violent pop as new vapors are formed and then condensed, making a thumping sound as they enter, hence the name. It has nothing to do with the rabbit from Bambi. Then out to a condenser, and then we have our white dog. It's very similar to the retorts you see in the Caribbean that are also heated by the previous still rather than having their own heat supply. Although those are usually run differently than here with our whiskey, but the technology is certainly similar. These group 3s and the thumper are usually not sent back to the still, but are usually just let out as waste. You can really think of a thumper as just another big distillation plate attached to the column, just separated. Now you might be wondering about how we are managing our group 1s and even our group 3s. Also, when you see that these stills tend to be run hot and fast, your concerns might even be more warranted. Reflux is pretty low, and so rectification is low as well. And our white dog often leaves at a lower ABV than you might expect in other column stills, say in the mid-70s ABV-wise. A mandated aging regimen, at least for some of the categories, will help soften these spirits, despite that the rough texture and sharp edges are a feature of many American whiskeys and considered part of the style. Now, while bourbon and rye have mandated new charred oak aging, they do not come with a minimum aging time or a barrel cask size requirement. Most producers are aging 4 years or so in barrel to deal with those heads and tails, as well as extract some oak character and get some color, etc. If we have 2 years of age in oak, we can use the word straight. Tennessee whiskey is by definition straight, although they may not add that to the labeling. Now, as I mentioned, Tennessee does have a mandated stage here when coming off the still, in that it has to be filtered through maple charcoal before going into barrel. At Jack Daniel's, these are 15-foot high vats filled 2/3 the way up with charcoal, and the spirit gets slowly filtered through it, taking almost 2 days to make it through. They can reuse the charcoal and it will last Jack maybe 6 to 9 months. This filtering is called the Lincoln County process. What's interesting is we will assume some subtractive effects that remove some harshness, but there is, I guess, an additive process in that the pH of the whiskey changes, rising from 5.5 coming off the still to up to 7.5 to 8. Reducing the acidity this much will definitely change the mouthfeel and texture, likely the main cause of Jack's mellowness. What also happens is by shoving our new make through this carbony charcoal, we are also catching some of those group 3s, additionally softening the texture and increasing that mellowness, which is a defining characteristic of Tennessee whiskey. But there are no real mandates for exactly how the Lincoln County process is used. It's really up to the distiller to decide if they want a product that shows it, or if they just want to do a little bit of it so they can put it on the label. So now, after the Lincoln County process in Tennessee, or just after the still otherwise, we head to maturation. The big players have these enormous warehouses or rickhouses stacked with barrels. A feature of the American southern states of Kentucky and Tennessee is that they are very hot in the summer. These usually uninsulated warehouses get incredibly hot. Say it's 90 Fahrenheit out, we can have 70 at the bottom levels and then 120 at the top. Then in the winter, it can get down to freezing. This cycle and inconsistency is actually a benefit to quality producers, as they can utilize barrels from different areas for different product blends. It's a rare case where bigger actually is better, as the little guys just don't have these options for maturation protocols. What little guys do instead is vary the barrel sizes and use barrels as small as 5 to 10 gallons for greater evaporation and oak contact. Compared to the low temperature and high humidity Scotland, here we can see a lot of water also leave and ABVs climb dramatically. Although in winter, we can have alcohol leave in greater percentages like we see in Scotland. Overall though, we see ABVs increase with maturation, especially in the big producing states of Kentucky and Tennessee. Now, in common with about any spirit category, this time in oak does things to the spirit within. But specifically, with our whiskeys in warm Kentucky or Tennessee, the high heat would also be a way to have some of those group 1s vaporize and leave through the barrel with the angel's share. So while we don't have a minimum aging with bourbon, it's very common for quality producers who use continuous stills and didn't make cuts to age in barrel for a while, usually longer than the straight minimums. Also remember that we have mandated charred barrels, so a layer of charcoal will be inside the barrel. Natural ebb and flow of spirit in and out of the barrel staves, accelerated by temperature fluctuations, will end up trapping some of our group 3s, leading to a smoother spirit with age. But like I mentioned, a coarseness or fleshy rough mouthfeel is expected in the category, so some group 3s are welcomed. And even if we used a hybrid or pot, we're going to cut a little bit later to include some group 3s and fatty acids to continue to create esters during our aging. So that is how our primary American whiskey categories are created. A few legal requirements and labeling terms we should also cover. We won't discuss small batch or barrel strength or single barrel because they don't have legal definitions. We hope they mean something on a bottle, and some producers have been caught out when they didn't. The hint is, don't do distillery tours if you don't want folks to figure out your small batch isn't really that small. The categories we mentioned, including bourbon, Tennessee, rye, wheat, corn, etc., cannot come off the still at more than 80% ABV. Our grain-based whiskeys that do are called light whiskey, and they have to come off at above 80% ABV. And these, again, cannot be aged in a new or charred oak container. All whiskey has to go into the bottle at least 40% ABV or 80 proof. So remember our early definition of bourbon and rye having mandated time in new charred oak barrel. Well, there isn't a mandated amount of time. Could be years, could be minutes, and it's still bourbon. What we do have at least is the term straight, which means the whiskey spent at least 2 years in that new charred oak barrel, albeit of any size. Bourbon cannot be colored or sweetened either, so any color has to come from barrel. So at least we have that to ensure or indicate a good amount of time was spent in oak. Now that 51% corn for bourbon and Tennessee and 51% rye, malt, wheat, etc. for those labels, when we have corn whiskey, we have an 80% minimum corn in the mash bill. Corn whiskey can't go into charred new oak either. It actually doesn't have to have any aging, but if it sees oak, it's new uncharred oak. Now the regulations actually say that any whiskey less than 4 years old or having a specific whiskey component less than 4 years old is required to have an aging statement showing the age of that youngest component. If everything is over 4 years old, then no age statement is required. A walk around the discount whiskey section of your local store tends to at least imply this regulation may not always be adhered to. Now, we have repeatedly mentioned whiskey's stereotypical association with the Wild West, and indeed during the 1800s, whiskey really exploded in popularity, and the aged versions were naturally more in demand. Business being business, especially in America, adulterated and unaged products were often pawned off as aged versions. Remember, the mid-1800s saw the invention of column stills, and just like in Scotland, fights arose between batch or pot still production and the more efficient, highly rectified, then colored products. And an attempt at some consumer protections were warranted. Also, during the Civil War, taxes on spirits were a big part of the federal budget. Now imagine being a distiller and being taxed on what came off the still versus what went into the bottle after the angels got done with it. The solution to both was government intervention and the notion of bonded products. If the government watched over your product in a bonded warehouse, you could then only pay taxes on the volume leaving the warehouse, not the volume that went into the warehouse. The spirit had to stay in oak in these warehouses for at least 4 years. And when it does go into the bottle, it has to go in at 50% ABV or 100 proof. Then it can state bottled in bond or bonded on the label. This concept of guaranteed quality through oversight and bonded warehouses is used in other spirit categories as well, not just whiskey. These Wild West days eventually went the way of the expected market consolidation, and the economies of scale and distribution channels meant the big boys ended up owning the whiskey market. Distribution networks and the shelf life of spirits meant the entire country could be supplied from the traditional whiskey production areas in Kentucky and Tennessee, where the big boys still operate today. Jack Daniel's is the largest and dominates the Tennessee whiskey category. It's part of Brown-Forman, who in their Kentucky operations also give us Woodford Reserve, Old Forester, and Early Times. Also in Kentucky, we have macro distilleries run by Beam Santori, Wild Turkey, which is part of Campari, Four Roses, owned by Japan's Kirin, and Buffalo Trace, who still manage to look artisanal with their family of labels like Pappy's, Blanton's, Weller, Eagle Rare, Taylor, Stagg, and more. The quiet giant is MGP out of Indiana, who produces and ages whiskeys for lots of folks in an almost secret manner. Redemption Rye, High West, Deadwood, Templeton Rye, Whistle Pig, Bullet all have MGP in them, or at least did so originally. Now, this outsourcing may seem a bit dubious, but it's also how many micro distilleries can get started. Just like in the 1800s, people want oak-aged whiskey. What do you do at your brand new distillery when people want your bourbon, but you can only make gin and vodka or corn whiskey for the first half of a dozen years or so? You bring in some stuff from MGP, maybe age it a little yourself, maybe blend some of their aged spirits in with your younger stuff until your own product matures. The American craft spirits movement has indeed exploded starting in the 1990s, and this arrangement has allowed it to survive and now thrive, and also innovate in ways the macro distilleries can't. We now see all sorts of different woods used for malting, new and old grains being tried out, giving some wonderful variety within this somewhat, yes, I'll say it, homogenized world of the big labels. Not only different woods, but those different barrel sizes as well. Remember that bourbon doesn't have a required aging. And if you put a spirit in a 5-gallon charred barrel rather than a 50-gallon barrel, the whole notion of time being an accurate static measurement goes out the window. Your oak influence is dramatically different in that 5-gallon barrel. It's an exciting time to be a whiskey drinker in the US, with tried and true quality products available from the big boys and all sorts of age ranges, as well as small artisan neighborhood distilleries popping up around the country. Hopefully this lecture gives you the tools to read the labels and know what's in the bottle and how it got there. See you next time.